Autumn's not home today. She's with her grandmother. Grandfather's still in the hospital. So I decided I was going to go out and get myself some food. Got a beer and a drink along with it. It was interesting because the thing I was talking about in regard to being able to tap into that sense of feeling, I don't think it was primarily that Autumn wasn't here, though that probably has something to do with it because it was more quiet because she wasn't around. But it was very revelatory to me as to why my father was probably an alcoholic, because he was probably very similar to me, genetically speaking. Who would think that, right? And I can see why he would be an alcoholic if he were especially having to work a job that I don't know he hated it, but it clearly wasn't what he wanted to do. He was a fantastic artist, and I work with artists for a living. He was a fantastic artist. Fantastic. He could have made a living at it easily. So it was interesting to me to realize, oh, maybe this is why my dad drank, because it makes it easy for him to transition states between, having to lock down and pay attention to work versus having to figure out how to unlock that part of him that gets to like relax and actually experience like who he actually is on the inside. Something like that. Anyway, it was also interesting how quickly that led to a sort of, how do I want to explain it? It's not necessarily like a debauchery and not necessarily like listening to listening to different angels of my nature. How's that? It was very easy for me to desire to like want to go out, gallivant, stuff like that, which I didn't do, but it was interesting how quickly that came to me. Anyway, so I decided what I want to do since I'd already found this state and used it through liquor. I was like, hey, let's try this with an experiment. So I decided I wanted to go over what I think are some of the things I need to say and need to outline. No, not need to say. What are the things I need to outline to understand the problem I'm trying to talk about? So let's start at the beginning. First off, we need to talk about what is inherent genetic and define those attributes and how they exist. So obviously you have your personality, obviously you have your morphism, you obviously have your gender. All right, so we have to talk about those, and we have to talk about those to some degree of resolution that allows us to understand what those things are and how they manifest. So how does being female default differently interact than how being female or than being male interacts default? Because obviously you can have one completely different personality substrate with a female overlay, and then one completely other different personality substrate with a male overlay, and to the naked observer those things may seem very similar, but that's because you have different personalities with different genders, which is an oversimplification and potentially not right, but that's not the point. It's more to illustrate what I'm talking about. So you need to understand what is the default way being a female interacts with a certain set of psychological and morphological principles. Similar to, you need to understand how a certain subset of those applies to male and psychological and morphological principles. And then you go to the other layer. How does the morphology actually apply to the gender specifics and the personality specifics? Then you need to actually understand the personality specifics and what the interplay is between the personality specifics. Which is kind of interesting because right now they don't have, best I can tell or best I've read or best I've heard, they don't have a hard definitive link with how someone that's more neurotic has a direct interplay with whether or not they're less orderly and how that actually manifests in behavior differently than what they could just apply to pure neuroticism scale. What's a better way to say that? The sophistication of measurement is as such now that currently applying an attribute to a trait explicitly applies it to only one trait. And they don't have a good way to understand how this trait is more prominent between a confluence of these two individual traits. This behavior is more prominent between the confluence of two individual traits and where they exist in that paradigm. So that's where you got to start. I'm not sure if there are any other genetic predispositions that you need to talk about. You definitely have to talk about personality. You definitely have to talk about morphology, and you definitely have to talk about gender. So I would just say categorically, genetically inherent attributes, understanding how they work, what their default mechanisms and levers of manipulation are, and how they operate enough in a vacuum that if you apply, so how do I put this? if you have one set of psychology and one set of morphology, the one set of gender specifics in terms of being a female will apply and overlay to that as such in a way that it is predictable how it will apply and overlay with it, because the gender is playing by the same rules no matter which circumstance you're putting in. It's just manifesting different behavior in different circumstances. Right, that's what I'm trying to say. So, genetic predisposition and understanding the genetic predispositions and the interplay between them. That's the first thing you have to talk about. Next thing you have to talk about. It's like that first layer of baking. So what I mean by that is, currently, based on best evidentiary knowledge, home family circumstance doesn't have as much of an impact on individual quote-unquote success as we're defining that as personality attributes. Right, obviously. So, but it's not to say they have none, right? It's just not there are very few places there are proven links between those things. Like growing up in a two-parent household, one male and one female, has obvious distinction between growing up with a single-parent household or a same-sex parent household, which isn't, whatever, not getting into that conversation. The point is there's measurable difference between those things, but in terms of when you're quantifying how that measurement plays into effect with the other things, the thinking is the other things are more relevant in terms of personality. But that's not the level of resolution that I want to approach this topic from or have this conversation from. It's not about which one is more important and to what degree they're more important, but to what degree does the fine-tuning happen. So anyway, point of that is the layer after genetic predisposition is sort of like the adolescence disposition, because those are the things I think that while they are happening, as in their current time, when they are occurring, right? So let's say from age 2 to age 4, for example. While they are occurring, the components, the individual influencing variables can be modified. They can be variable. Like you could have a two-parent household and your parents would get divorced, for example. Or you could have a single-parent household and your mother finds a new husband before you're to the point where you're properly registering and differing with that. So the environmental variables can change, and they can fundamentally change the composition of what happens in the early adolescent structure. But once the early adolescent structure gets to a certain point in sort of like the timeline of where it's happening and developing, there comes a point where it more highly concretizes, and it's not necessarily possible to easily modify those attributes because they become solidified and ossified. So after the genetic predisposition is figuring out or talking about what the early adolescent predisposition is, what are the controlling environmental factors, which ones are the highest level of primacy, and to what degree can they be modified, and how much do they ossify if they do, which I think they do, but talk about it like I think they do. What's that time frame? What are the primary attributes that have influence stakes? So what happens after that? I don't know, let me think. So I guess that's more properly defined as childhood. So then after that, you probably have early adolescence. And I think an important aspect of how all these things tie together is you start at a point of borderline intractability because you're referring to the genetic, and the further you progress along the timeline, the more you're getting to a less intractable state of affairs, which is to say, if something happened to you that was traumatic when you're 26, it's potentially easier to correct than if something traumatic happened to you at age 7, which I think fits with the current research, but that's what I'm going for anyway. So period after childhood, early adolescence, to what level does it ossify? To what level is it influenced by either of the pre-existing conditions, being personality or childhood, and the ossification of childhood? And what are the primary contributory factors outside of those things that have already been established through those first two periods? So let's say maybe this is the first time that you realize as a boy females are attractive, right? That does some stuff to you. So it's sometime around that period, and between, I'll say, what's a good period to target? I don't know. I'm thinking somewhere between age 7 and age 9, but I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, we'll say that's the quantification layer. Something about early adolescence, which is sometime probably after age 7 or age 9, and up to, I want to say maybe age 16, somewhere in that neighborhood probably. So what are the intractable factors at that point? What are the new variables that can change in the live and the now during that point? And to what level do those things ossify, and what is the complication level of extracting those things and replacing them with something else? So that's, we'll say, the early adolescence layer. Then you probably have the late adolescence layer, again, on top of the previous 3 layers. Primary contributory factors. You've already... It's weird because I feel like the pecking order and the hierarchy establishment is different between the different, I want to say, eras of human development in terms of an individual life. I feel like by the time you're past 15 or 16, some of your hierarchical establishment has started to solidify, at least in terms of your peer group inside of your school or your social groups. So you already have some idea where you stand by that point, in a way that where you stand is understood, believed, agreed upon by you, is a better way to say it. You agree upon what your hierarchical station is to some point. I mean, that potentially that could be different to the point of, I disagree and I should have better than this, or it could be some level of I disagree and I should have worse than this, but that goes back to the previous 3 layers and how those were actually built and structured, right? Right. So what is that time period? And I'm going to say that's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 to 20. And then you have the last stage, which has other factors also built upon the previous 4. Much reduced ossification, probably lasts until about age 26. And I think most things after 26, which is around when the brain finishes fully developing, that's when you've reached the final sort of level of what I am defining in this context as ossification. So I think that's sort of a good outline, a good starting point, trying to understand how those things work. I'm not entirely sure how to do it, because there's some things that are empirically obvious to one degree, and there's some things where you have to take the empirically obvious and put it into the mystically dubious, which is to say personality traits and interplay, for example. It's very understood how one personality trait can lead to a certain kind of behavior, but once you start saying, well, this personality trait at this level interacting with this personality trait at this different level, interacting with this third personality trait at this even different level, causes this particular behavior to manifest more. At that point, you're starting to get into the little bit of the mystical of what we don't fully understand yet, because science is hard. So it's like, what are the mystical elements of that? What are the predictable things based on what do we know about the science? What seems to make sense as the logical extension of the science past the point where it potentially fully makes sense and seems like it's obvious, but past the point where it makes sense, almost to the point where you're getting where you're starting to speak in the terms of the metaphysical. I don't know it requires speaking in terms of the metaphysical, but I don't know it doesn't. So I'm open to that one way or the other. And then I guess, I don't know if anything needs to come after that. I mean, I think something does need to come after that in terms of explanation, like, okay, you know all this now, what do you do with it, and what do you do about it? Because if the point of this is to learn the nature so we can obey it, so we can command it. So, but I don't know the goal of the first effort needs to involve understanding how to command it, or even understanding how to obey it. I think maybe the first effort just needs to cover understanding how to understand it. Because I don't think the first effort is, let's say, fit for consumer consumption. How's that? In terms of the, who's better, Tesla or Edison? Edison, because he brought his ideas to market. I don't think the thing I'm talking about, that's the first phase, brings any ideas to market per se. It's more about understanding the nature of flight to some degree. Something like that. So I think the first thing to start with is the actual genetic layer. How does morphology seem to affect I mean, we know morphology affects group placement, but what have we actually determined in terms of the scientific literature about how morphology considers placement? That's, one aspect that needs to be understood. What do we know about the manifestations of particular personality traits? And I think one of the efforts that explicitly needs to come in terms of the personality traits is understanding the scale of utility between them, which is to say 100th percentile of neuroticism. I don't think any extreme of any particular personality disposition is a blessing or a curse per se. I think it's more indicative of society's capability to understand, properly utilize, and leverage those particular extremes of behavioral or psychological personality disposition. Higher IQ, higher openness, and then higher industriousness that leads to being more successful in the modern world. But does that mean the modern world's right or biology's right? And biology's more right than we currently understand how to utilize the modern world. I think it's the latter. So first would be sort of defining the scale of personality. So if you're 0th percentile of neuroticism, what's the catastrophic failure version of that, and what's the superpower version of that? And then to the 100th percentile of neuroticism, what's the catastrophic failure version of that, and what's the superhero version of that? And I think once you define that's interesting, because you might actually need to prescribe a plus minus attribute to psychological attributes. So it might not necessarily be that you're in the 100th percentile and that's that. It might be that you're in the 100th percentile plus or minus. That could be the case. That makes sense. Because that's telling you whether or not you've learned to leverage that 100th percentile as like a superpower or as a curse. That's interesting. Yeah, that might be accurate. Something like that. Figuring out and identifying those. So once you get all those pieces for the known psychological behavioral aspects, then you can start to mix and match those things together to say, okay, if someone is a 100th percentile neuroticism, and here's the plus and minus of how those look, here's the 40th percentile industriousness, here's the plus and minus of how those work. How might those things interrelate if both are pluses, both are minuses, one's plus, one's minus, one's plus, one's minus? Then you can start to actually outline some potential definitions between what the interplay might be. So I think that's one of the first efforts. Yeah. Trying to map that. And the thing is, I've already known that for a while. I just haven't done it. I didn't know the plus minus thing. I knew the plus minus thing, but not as clearly as I did when I said plus minus. So I already knew I had to define that. I just haven't. Because it's scary and I don't want to waste my time and be crazy and have delusions of grandeur. But I think that's right. I think that's where I start. Figuring out what the possible variations of morphology are beyond meso and ecto. Though meso and ecto and what's the third one? I can't remember. They might be good enough. So what's interesting about ecto, like if you think about ectomorphs, what's interesting about them is one ectomorph isn't the same as another ectomorph. One person carries the weight of being an ecto better than another person carries the weight of being an ecto. So I wonder what the differential is there. I don't know, but something about figuring out those scales, plus and minuses, something equivalent, how they work together. Then the gender is trying to figure out some things that are key, specific, identified to gender. Like for example, males, more aggressive, let's say, women more social, let's say, for just the purposes of trying to explain what I'm talking about. And trying to figure out what those actual hard and fast rules are about the differences between the genders. Because obviously the way they interplay with personality, it gets super complicated. So you start saying, foolish things like women are fundamentally no different than men along these personal vectors, or if they are, the margin of error is so small that it doesn't matter. But that's an understanding and measurement problem. That's not a truth of the circumstance problem. And we're trying to understand the truth of the circumstance, which just means let's figure out a better measurement utility, right? Right. So trying to figure out a better measurement utility and trying to identify the things that are core attributes that are different between those genders. Like if you were to try to oversimplify that concept, you could say, basically what they did with yin and yang, women are life, men are death. That's a really good sort of religious level simplification of that concept. So try to expand and broaden that out a little bit. What does it mean for women to be life? What does it mean for men to be death? And figure out how that actually works and interplays. Or at least hypothesize it, because proving it is going to be borderline impossible. So hypothesize it, philosophize it, if you will. Yeah, so I think that's the first step. Start identifying them. Start attempting to define them, and in their utility and potential to be a plus and minus, not in terms of the higher levels of neuroticism are more prone to experiencing negative emotion. That's a very specific statement that means a very specific thing that explicitly says higher neuroticism is bad. Not like that. Figuring out a new definition layer for them. Higher neuroticism means you have more capability in a regard to do X. And if you're plus on that scale, X manifests like this. If you're minus on that scale, X manifests like this. Trying to define them like that and trying to figure out what that definition looks like. Do that for all the genetic layers. Review. Find out whether or not you missed any genetic layers. Find out whether or not, after rereading and reading new information, listening to new findings, whether or not anything that you've established in that regard seems wrong or off with newly gained knowledge. Get through that review process where you feel comfortable enough with it to say, at least this is good enough for now, then move on to the childhood layer. I think that's the plan. Something like that.